Welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today for our webinar, Your Customer and Featured Data Together. This is between mParticle and Split, and we're super excited to welcome my colleague, Talia Nassi, a developer advocate from Split, and also the Director of Engineering from mParticle, Melissa Benua. And they are going to take you through this great journey to get today, sharing their stories. And I hope you can walk away feeling a little bit more inspired and empowered when you go back. And feel free to do Q&A through the chat. We will get to them at the end, but as the questions come up, just feel free to put them in the chat. My name is Leah and I'm from Split, and thank you again for joining us. I'm going to hand it off to Talia to kick it off.
Great. Okay, so first I want to start off by talking about testing in production. So testing in production means you're testing your features in the environment that your features will live in. So it means not using a dummy environment like staging or a QA environment. I want to know that my feature works in production. And that's kind of how I envision testing in production. And the key to testing in production is feature flagging. And feature flagging is a tool that allows you to target specific users, and it's super beneficial, especially when you're testing in production, because you can say, hey, I want these users to get this experience and these users to get this other experience. So this is kind of what I envision it to look like. We have this feature flag here on the left, and inside of it, I'm targeting my internal users. So that's everyone that's on my development team. So my developers, my testers, product design, my automation bots. So everyone that needs to have access to this feature before my users see it, they're going to be targeted inside of the feature flag. So if there's a bug or if something goes wrong while we're testing, it's okay, because only we will have access to it, and none of our end users will be affected by this bug. So once did you have a question?
Yeah, a question. I have a question, Talia.
Yeah.
So is that sort of like building a ring strategy when you're shipping box software?
Is it like what?
Sort of like building a ring strategy, like how Windows likes to talk about their internal users ring and their beta users ring.
Yeah, it's kind of like that. It's you're ensuring that your software works for a certain group of people before you ship it out. So yeah. And then once you're done testing, testing within the feature flag and you know that your feature is working in production, then you turn on the feature flags for everyone. And now all your users are happy and they're dancing because they have a perfect feature in production and you didn't give them any bugs. So this is like a win-win situation, because your developers have an increased confidence when they release because they know that their feature is working, and then your end users are happy because you don't have any bugs when you release. So it's just a way to make sure that there's like no surprises and just another security blanket when you're releasing. So something else that is really important when you're testing in production is obviously data, and making sure that your real user data doesn't affect your test data and vice versa. You want to make sure that those don't mix.
Why? Why, Talia? Why do we want to make sure that we don't have test data mixed in with our real data?
So it's important that they don't mix, because you make your business decisions from things that your end users do, not from things that your tests do. So if your automated test is running the same thing, 5 times a day in production, you don't want to use that data to make business decisions. You want real user data to make those decisions. So that's why. So how do we solve this problem? So something that you can do is create a consistent naming convention for your test users. And something that works well for me is to have a Boolean. So something like is test user is true. And so when I see this in the code, I know that this user is a test user. And these users will look like real users and they'll act like real users in the UI, but we know that they're test users. And because they have this flag, our data team knows to exclude this from all of our data and analytics so that it won't be in the same place as a real user event, like a real click event in production or something like that. And then for our backend, we have a backend flagging system that's used to identify all of these test entities. So in our test, we would have our test users interacting with our test entities. And this is something that you can hard code. So you can say, I want to log in as this test user and perform these specific actions with these specific test entities. And that's how you make sure that your data doesn't get combined with real user data, because you can filter out in your analytics tool, in your data tool, you can filter out and say, I only want to see the actions from users who have this is test user set to false. And that means it's like your real users. So that's kind of how I think about testing in production and feature flags and data molded together. And then I think Melissa is going to take it over from here.
Yeah, so those are all really important principles, especially about keeping your users and your test data, your test users and your test data and your real users and your real data totally separate.
Yeah.
And I know Talia and I both have long, extensive experience testing in production, and the risks that come when you accidentally are polluting one way or the other, whether you're giving your real users very bad experiences or you're polluting all your real data with very bad test data. So let's talk a little bit about how to build that test data, how to use those test users, and how to do some data-driven testing in production, because that's really what we want to do, right? If you're going to test in production, your test should be data-driven. They should be running, they should be able to run continuously or pretty close to continuously, or at least very, very, very regularly. And they should probably be able to run at scale, because when you're in production, things behave at production scale. And so there's really three parts to building any data testing automation platform. Right? You need to model your data. We at mParticle are all about data and data models and understanding very cleanly what our data is doing. So you need to model your data, whether that's using your internal model, whether that's understanding what your users are doing at the input level. You need to have a very clean understanding of what your data is going to look like. You need to make a plan for what you're going to do to that data. The simplest form of testing in production is just taking copies of real user data and sending it through and seeing what happens. And that's interesting, right? Taking a copy of a real user and doing exactly what your real users are doing is interesting, but doesn't always cover the full breadth and span of scenarios that you as a developer team may be interested in covering. And so you need to make a plan for how you're going to modify that test data to be useful to fulfill whatever your testing needs are, whether that's doing random changes to the data, using some fuzz testing, or doing some very strategic markup, or injecting data for a new feature, right? Grafting some new feature functionality onto an existing user. Maybe you're adding a new identity, and so you want to test the new identity and graft it onto your test data from your N-1 release. And finally, you're going to need something to tell you what happened. And that's called an oracle. And your oracle could be a human, right? It could be a human. It could be your existing monitoring system. We'll talk a little more in depth about what that could be. But you're generally speaking better served, again, at scale by having a machine do that. Machines are very good at pattern recognition and mass. You don't even need machine learning, just simple oracles that say, if X happens, then it's good. And if Y happens, it's bad. And that can alert you that something has gone wrong, especially when you're testing at scale. So this is a data model. If you want to give it a couple more clicks, Talia, some magic's going to show up. Ooh, just one more. It's going to sparkle. Yeah, this is our sparkly data model. It's just some totally random event data that I found laying around. So this is a data model. And so the first part of any testing or production strategy, right, is understanding your test data. What are we doing? What are we trying to accomplish, and how are we going to do it? So this is a very simple JSON-based data model, right? When you consider a JSON post body, it has a method, of course, it has the URI, it has all the standard HTTP parts of an HTTP request. But JSON itself has a format, right? JSON has a structure, it has concept of arrays, it has the concept of objects, it has the concept of validity versus invalidity, right? Things have to be in quotes and separated with colons, and they have to have commas. JSON looks a certain way. And so when you are either modifying or crafting your test data, it needs to be valid, right? Because it's not very interesting to test your JSON parser, for example, in production. If 90% of your test data fails to parse JSON, 90% of your test data is not testing anything. So being aware of your data model is sort of your first and foremost thing. You can't really proceed anywhere useful without that. And your data could look like anything. It doesn't have to be. Yeah, that's your question.
When you run your tests, are you looking for specific things that are in the response?
I may be. So it sort of depends on your testing scenario. In some cases, it could be that you're looking for the responses back because you have a synchronous request response data flow. So you can just say, if I pass you in a request that looks like this, I expect to get back a 200 OK with this in the response and this sort of data blob that comes back. That's one way of validating. In some cases, though, you'll have asynchronous. Or you'll have asynchronous APIs. mParticles, for example, when you post up an event into our server-to-server API, it's asynchronous, right? We do a lot of processing on that event. We'll tell you, yes, we got it. But that yes, we got it doesn't give you the full breadth of things that happen to it. And so to explore the breadth of things that happen to it, we'll be looking for things that aren't on the direct request response model line. We'll be looking for side effects, or an artifact dumped out into our metrics, or an artifact dumped out into our data lake, or flags along the way that mark the correct processing, right? I handled this request ID using observability, right? Using for example, the unique ID, we can say, I saw this test event come in service A, B, C, and D, and it came in the right places, and I had all the right metrics flagged. So we can harness some of our observability, which we'll talk about it as oracles a little later, to tell us what happened and if it was good or bad. Okay. No, you're right. Okay. So if we take that, that exact same event, and if we want to take that event and instead make it a test case, right? Make it something especially interesting that's not just a very silly event. We can see in green that we've marked it up. And we've marked it up in a data-aware manner, right? We know that the timestamp is supposed to be an integer. It's still an integer. It's just an interesting integer now. Likewise, we can see that the customer ID is supposed to be a string. It's still a string. It's totally a valid JSON string. There's maybe something interesting happening inside. But this is a test case. And even this test case is maybe doing too much. It's just sort of a demo. But you can see the things we didn't modify, right? We didn't break the JSON. We didn't break our authorization. We didn't break the fundamental structure of the HTTP request to ensure that it still goes to the right place. But we made just a dump of a log. We sanitized it and made it into an interesting test data. And so the way we did that, right, was using our plan. Because when you're testing in production, especially when you're testing at scale, you don't necessarily have time to craft individual requests, right? It doesn't scale very well to lovingly handcraft every single one of your test requests that you're going to send in. You're usually a lot better served generating a whole set, whether you're generating from sanitized customer data, whether you're generating them programmatically because because you have a generator, or however else. You're generally speaking better off generating a whole bunch of them and then deterministically modifying them in some way so that you have percentages of things that have happened. Okay, so you're insured, you're insured through math and not because you handcrafted all of your tests. So you want to make a plan for how you're going to modify your test data. what's important to you and what isn't. And knowing how you modify your test data is how you're going to craft your interesting tests, and crafting interesting tests is going to do things to your service. And so, right, that's the whole point of testing, is to do things, to find interest, to do things and see what's interesting. Right? You want to know what's going to fall over and when and where and how, preferably before your customers find out. So knowing that you found something, go back. Knowing that you found something in production, whether you're monitoring request response, as Talia said earlier, whether you're looking for side effects, whether you're looking for crashes, or maybe you're just looking for crashes, you're looking at your core downs, whether you're harnessing your observability and looking at logs and your metrics, show you different sorts of things, but also important things. You're gonna find this all these sets of things. So if we go to the next slide here, the way you're going to know that you found something and it is good or bad is the concept of an oracle. And so an oracle is what reads, for example, we'll say, I'm looking at my HTTP 500 error counter and it's below 0.1%, so it's fine. Or it says, I'm looking at my HTTP error counter and it's at 5%, and this is bad. And we should trigger an alert or fail the test. Somebody needs to look, something is probably wrong here. Oracles can be very simple, from parsing a response, status code 200 good, status code 500 bad, response with string foo in it good, response with string bar in it bad. They can monitor your metrics, they can monitor log output, they can monitor side effects, right? Whatever, if you can harness it and get the data to something, it can be monitored as a part of your Oracle. Your Oracle can make decisions about it. And your Oracle can be as simple as using your existing alerting system. Right? You can get a lot of mileage out of that, or a more custom solution to give you some more fine-grained information, especially if you've been very careful to silo your test data out of your alerts. But there's nothing worse than waking up at 2 a.m. for a site down alert, but it turns out it's just all test data. Right, that's the worst.
Something I like to do is I'll have like pager duty set up for like the really urgent, like you need to wake up right now and fix this type of alert. And then I have Slack set up for the alerts that are like, the tests have been passing and everything's okay, or like this small warning, or just like the lower level alerts. But yeah, it's definitely not a fun experience when you wake up at 2 a.m. and figure out like a test is causing problems.
It's the worst. I mean, it's not fun to wake up at 2 a.m. anyway, but I'm always happy to do it for a good cause. But the test failing on a test only issue is usually not that good cause.
Oh.
Yeah, the dashboards are good as well that have just-in-time notifications. It does have to push to you rather than waiting to be read. I see a mistake a lot of teams make is setting up a dashboard and calling it good enough. But then the reality is that either somebody's job is to stare at a screen all day watching a dashboard go by, which is super boring and not an effective use of anybody's time, or nobody looks at the dashboard and then they have failures that go for weeks until somebody remembers it exists and goes and looks and says, oh, whoops. And my pet peeve, and the reason I talk a lot about reliability and pushing notifications to the right place at the right time, is when you have built something, you have tested it extensively, you have set up the automation, you have set the automation to run, and then you ignore everything the automation tells you and do whatever anyway. Right, whether that's because the automation is flaky and you don't trust, oh my gosh. Right, flaky automation is notorious for driving this behavior. But so are dashboards. Dashboards are pretty notorious for that too. Because nobody looks, right? If somebody has to be looking at just the right place and time, they probably won't be.
Yeah, I think it's important, like just to what you said about just trusting your test. Like if your test is failing, it means something's wrong. And whether that's something in the test or something in your performance or something in the code, like something's happening, so you need to go fix it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, knowing something has gone wrong is really important, and trusting that when something tells you it's gone wrong and it's real.
Yeah.
I don't know about you, but I have definitely shipped bugs to production that were tested and they were reported on. And we ignored the test failures because it was in a notoriously flaky test suite. And we got conditioned to, oh yeah, that test suite always pops these 5 errors and we don't know why it's flaky, but we've ignored it the past, 15 times we've hot fixed. And surely this time it looks like about the same set of failures, so we're just going to ignore it.
Wow.
And then, whoopsies, turns out it told you a real thing, but didn't look at it. And it was years ago that I did this, but it was a lesson that you don't forget. You don't forget.
No, I can imagine. I always like to say, like, there's no such thing as a flaky test. Like, either the test is passing and it's giving you confidence that your feature is working, or if it's failing, it means like something is wrong. And it's not necessarily the feature, it could be the test, but something's wrong and you need to go fix it. I just don't like the term flaky test.
Exactly.
It's just like, something's wrong, go fix it,
Exactly. So something is always wrong. That actually came, I was working with somebody who's developing a new automation framework, and they were asking me, hey, what's your line for automation reliability? I said, because I'm at about, they kept revising it upwards. First it was they were at 10% false positives, and then they were 5%, and then they were at 1%. It kept, every time they gave me a number, it was a smaller number. And I said, it's 99.9%. I want 1 out of 1,000 false failures, and that's my bar. And as we drilled down into why this was flaky, it turned out that there was, it's not that the automation was written badly. It wasn't even that the product code was written badly. It was that the automation was running immediately after deployment to an environment. And it was, in fact, a health check that was wrong. A health check was reporting a service is ready before it was actually ready. And so, I mean, sure, it's a limited problem, right? It's only a problem for the first 5 minutes after you deploy, but what happens to the users who are affected by those first 5 minutes after you deploy?
Yeah.
That's a real problem. What started as, this is flaky automation, how flaky can we let it be, was actually a real issue that affects users in production.
Yeah. Yeah, I think a lot of people are just conditioned to think exactly what you said, like, oh, if it's failing, it's like the test, it's fine. But you need to go back and figure out what's going on.
Exactly. I don't want to knock on browser-based testing, because browser-based testing definitely has a time and a place, but I feel like in general, browser-based testing may have done us as testers a disservice, because it is notoriously timing-based, and that is tricky to make reliable. I mean, any sort of testing that's timing-based, right? That involves waits to see what happens, is going to be intrinsically unreliable.
I like that. All testing is timing-based. Gonna tweet that later.
Yeah, any test that can be made deterministic is better. And I know we've digressed a little, but whenever you see somebody using a sleep to try to resolve a timing issue, it's usually a sign of a deeper problem.
Yeah, usually a performance issue, but.
Yeah, what is the most egregious use of thread.sleep that you've seen, Talia? We've all got that story.
I think just like waiting for objects on a page to load. Like if you're waiting 10 seconds for a link to appear, like there's something wrong. Like go fix the link, go fix save. Like you should never have a sleep for 10 seconds. Like your user isn't going to sit there and wait for this link. Why should the test wait, Yeah,
users are not going to wait 10 seconds. They're going to wait 1 second.
Yeah, the whole point of having tests, especially tests in production, is to emulate what your user is going to do. And if you're making all these exceptions for the tests, you're just moving farther and farther from that goal. So
exactly, you're divorcing yourself from your actual users, which is a risk, right? People setting up a straw man and testing against that straw man is, even though you may be testing in a production environment, you're not actually testing in production. It's not a production-like system with a production-like behavior.
Exactly.
There's a fine line to tread. Let's see here. What were we talking about here? The kind of things you can find when you're testing in production. So obviously you're going to find some things, but testing in production is generally speaking not about functional testing. Would you agree with that, Talia? Or you're not testing a function for I give you 8 and you gave me true.
Yeah, I think it can be function-based, but for the most part, you're trying to find things that are in production that you didn't know were there.
Exactly. And a lot of those things, right, assuming you have a reasonable unit testing strategy, a lot of those things are probably going to be integration based, right? Are these services speaking well together? Are they translating, is the exception thrown from service A translating into the right error message, returned as an HTTP 5, 400 from service B? Or other scale issues. Thread contamination was a big one we would find only ever in production when I was working on a native service, on a C++ service. Almost impossible to drive out thread contamination, certainly at a unit test. Very, very difficult, and they're not well suited, right? Because that involves race conditions, which is a timing issue. It can be a race condition, especially if you're using unmanaged memory, right? It just letting somebody else read into your memory space.
Right.
We definitely drove out, again, when I was on that unmanaged service, we only through our testing and production system, which tested at scale, right? Because we had to have a certain amount of traffic going through so we could make bad things happen. But only ever reproduced on the true production environments because systems had to be under a certain amount of load to make the thread contamination obvious enough that our oracles could find it. Otherwise, it was a needle in a haystack. And the thread contamination was bad. It was one user would make a request and you would sometimes get the results for another user.
Oh no, what?
Yeah, we had different processing threads. It turned out different processing threads could read into each other's memory. You would occasionally overwrite one's response with another thread's response. This was a decade ago now. But that's exactly the kind of thing you could only ever find testing in production because it had to be in production. It was impossible to reproduce non-production.
Yeah, and you would have never known that if you didn't test in production.
We would never have known if we weren't testing in production. In fact, it had been there for a while. It was very low repro. It was impossible to find in the monitoring. Like, how would you know? The only way we found that was testing in production. And it took us, once we turned on the testing solution, we drove it out within a week. So we could talk about it a little bit. Actually, why don't you go first? Why don't you tell me about the first time you tested in production and what happened as soon as you did it?
Ooh, what a good story. The first time I tested in production, I was just starting out at a company. So I was interviewing for this company and they told me that they test in production while I was in the interview. And meanwhile, I had never heard about this topic, I only a few years of testing experience. I was very junior. And then the interviewer said, no, we test in production here. We don't have any staging environments. And I was so confused. And then once I started to practice it, the first test I think I did in production was a sticky banner for an event that was happening at this company. So it was just a sticky banner that was placed on the bottom of a page. But I just remember initially being so afraid of running this test in production. I can only imagine this is the same response that I get from everyone else who I talk about it with is you're so afraid at first. And then once you do it and you gain that confidence and you know how to use feature flags and you have the right data, it really is so beneficial. But I was super afraid, and now I'm just how did I ever test in staging? Why did I ever accept that as being a good place to test? What about you? What were your first experiences like?
So I will never forget being in the meeting room. It was at a org-wide all hands, so we still had SDETs at the time, and being in the meeting room when the SDET director told all of us, we're going to test in production. And there wasn't that wasn't a phrase people use. It was at the same time as we were doing some DevOps work, DevOps wasn't a word, those things didn't exist. They said, we're going to test in production because we heard other big software company does it. We had a lot of that. And everybody threw their hands up in the air. What do you mean we're testing in production? Do you mean we're just not testing? Are we only testing after code rolls out? There was almost widespread revolt until they explained the strategy, right? Of, oh no, like it's in production, it's production machines. We've carved off a small set of the machines that will take prod traffic as well, but will be addressable with, specifically for a testing URL, so we can exclude them more easily from our production metrics. We can, ignore alerts from it. And as I started rolling out test strategies, it turns out that was an underpinning part of our DevOps transformation. When we didn't call it DevOps transformation because we didn't, like, that wasn't a thing. But it was part of our transformation from whatever our quarterly release cycle, which was horrific for a software online services company in the grand old year of 2009, into a continuous delivery process, which was when we first rolled it out. My first direct experience with it when I first did it is I had this service, very similar to what I've described here. It was a service that took sanitized user data, did some markup to it, sent that data into an environment, and then read a bunch of, read both responses and a bunch of side effects to determine what happened. Like, is it good? Is life good or not? And the first time we turned it on in production at scale, we found all kinds of crazy things. We found the thread contamination. We found memory leaks. This is the code that had otherwise been well tested. It had been very well tested in the test environment, but the test environment diverged enough from production that there was still a bunch of stuff that we found. Crashes. We found crashes. Not just exceptions, not just fatal exceptions that got handled or whatever by the main exception handler, but actual crashes. We cratered machines that had to be then taken out of production and we've definitely killed ourselves, killed the production limited part. This is why we limited testing in production to only certain sets of machines. You didn't accidentally take down all of production by testing in production.
Yeah, don't do that.
Don't do that. If you're going to test in production, make sure you have a way of A, stopping it, and B, siloing it off so it doesn't kill all of your things.
Yeah.
But we definitely took that, that siloed part of production down a bunch of times before we, stabilized with regular deployments, regular tests, and we're able to more quickly find those problems.
Yeah.
That also, and incidentally, drove us adding the feature to that automation test suite of being able to run either in production or locally. Because it turns out we could give people local dev environments that were similar enough that they could at least reproduce some of the issues locally in the debugger.
Oh, that's good.
At least give it a try.
Yeah. Cool. Should we keep going with the slide?
Yeah. We can do that.
Oh.
Look, Talia, we can ask more questions and answers. I have a question for you.
Sure.
And I know, obviously, you can't tell me exactly, but what is the coolest bug you have found in production?
Ooh, this is a good question. The coolest bug? The coolest bug I found in production. Okay, this was done not through automation. This was just exploratory testing in production. So it was a security issue where you didn't need a password to log into this system. So our automation bots, they had their own username and password, and so they were passing. And then I think one time when I logged in, I hit the enter button too early, or I hit submit or something without a password in production, and it worked and it authenticated me. And then I knew that you don't need a password to be authenticated for the system, and that was a huge security issue for the product we were using. So that was, I think, pretty cool, because there was something wrong with the test where it wasn't catching that error. So yeah, that was pretty cool. What about you?
That's impactful. Wow. It is scary too. Imagine
Oh yeah.
Living out of production, just being able to log in. I know some severe ramifications to that, which is perhaps
Thankfully, like,
understatement of the year.
Like, yeah, the feature flag was still off. Like, it hadn't been turned on to the world yet, which was good.
Nice. Feature flagging saves the day.
Yeah, for the win.
Let's see, the coolest flag I've ever found in production. The thread contamination one was pretty cool because it took us, we were there all night trying to find, once we understood that it was happening, trying to find a reproduction so we could try to figure out where the bad photos, or where we were failing to close the screen.
Yeah.
Barring that, coolest bug we found in production. I would say, I remember now. So we were spinning up some security testing, same thing. And we had at one point this plugin that let us interact with Facebook, and you could write things to, post things to people's wall, but you had to be, in theory, you had to be authenticated with Facebook, and you had to give it these permissions. However, we discovered that there was an XSS exploit that you could bypass, and I don't remember if it was Facebook's bug or our bug, but you could do it. Basically, you could go to our service through a specific URL. You can have somebody click on a URL, like you could post a URL wherever, and have somebody click on it, and it would auto-post something to their wall.
Oh.
And not tell them anything about it. Whether they were logged into our service or whatever, as long as they were logged into Facebook, you could have them click the link, and it would post whatever it was, whatever you said, but then, embedded into the link, it would post it up to their Facebook wall. It wouldn't notify them or anything, so they would just have to hope that they saw it.
That's one of like the OWASP top 10, what you know what I'm talking about?
It is now.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know it's a OWASP top 10 vulnerability is XSS cross-site scripting.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we were involved in a cross-site scripting exploit to Facebook. And again, I don't remember exactly what our role is in causing that exploit. I do know that we turned that feature off regardless because that was dangerous, but we didn't need the PR about it, even though it was, whether it was or wasn't our bug, it looked bad for us either way.
Was it happening in staging too?
It was something we could only test in production due to the keys that we needed with Facebook.
Okay.
Something about how we had to configure Facebook. It was only testable in production anyway, and it was flighted. It was feature flagged. We were doing a bug bash, and I had owned a bunch of security testing at the time, and so I was known as the person you sent code to if you wanted to drive out weird things. If you wanted weird things to happen, they sent me, added me to their bug bash teams. And so it was on a flight. It was easy to turn off. But it was definitely probably the craziest thing. I did send the link out. I did because if you had the link, you could put yourself on the flight as well. So I did send the link out to a few of my friends just for fun.
Yeah, that's so intense.
Nothing bad, and then we shut it off.
Yeah.
A few people post things to their wall, and then we turned it off, and then it was fine.
Yeah, and you would have never known about this had you not tested it in production, which is why I
would have found out about it by a nasty press release.
Well,
bad publicity.
I just want to point out both of our Twitter handles in case anyone else has questions or wants to chat with us on Twitter. And I think we'll take questions from the audience now.
Yeah, I love questions.
Let's go to our questions.
All right.
Great. So our first question is, which tests should be run in production versus non-production tests?
That's a good question. So you can still use staging environments for like pre-production testing, and this can be done for like financial systems that abide by SOX compliance or like privacy related efforts. Each product has like sensitive flows that really like if management gives you a hard time about certain things, like you can still use staging for those tests, but ideally you would want to do as much as you can that would emulate an exact user in production. So You can still use staging for like things that have to do with SOX compliance or like data and privacy related efforts, but I would say everything else should be done in a production environment.
And you want to be careful as well about any testing that you know is going to be destructive.
Yes.
Right? You don't want to accidentally impact your prod users. Capacity testing is one that needs to be done in a production-like environment, but you want to be very careful it's not going to affect your production resources, because often during capacity testing, right, you're trying to push to the tipping point, and you don't want your actual users on the machine when it hits that tipping point. That would be very sad for them.
Great, thank you. And then what's the right way to get feedback from an Oracle? Melissa, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, that's a good question. The right way to get feedback from an Oracle is whatever way you're going to look and take actions on it, which is, I know, kind of a non-answer. But it sort of depends on what feedback mechanisms you have in place, right? If everybody is on Zoom or everybody's on Slack, 24/7, and doesn't have, is used to respond to Slack notifications, then a carefully curated set of Slack notifications is probably a great way to get feedback of, hey, your ongoing tests have failed. If people are, if you have an org that's dedicated to monitoring dashboards and it is somebody's job to sit and look at dashboards all day, then that can be an okay place, especially if you have scheduled or timed releases as opposed to a continuous delivery flow. And so you can go and look at a dashboard before you make a go live or not go live decision for a given flight, right? Or a given A/B test. Otherwise, I mean, really the real thing is wherever you're going to look. Email used to be a popular place. I find that we all have so many emails now that stuff just gets shoved into a folder and nobody looks at it anymore. But wherever it's going to give you the right information in time for you to take a reasonable action on it is the right place.
Great. We also have a question about should test in production when we use third-party services mocked?
When I've worked with third parties when I test in production, what's worked best for me is to just have like a header in the API request that I send to the third party and then work with them and tell them like, hey, any request that you get with this header is coming from a test, so I want you to handle it differently and like tell them what you want. Like I've done that a few times with different third parties, and that's worked for me. Melissa,
I think it depends as well on the goal of your testing. We have some tests, they don't run at a very large scale, right? We certainly don't want to stress test our partners, but we have a class of tests that hit some of our integration partners because we need to know if they have made changes, right? We don't always get told that they've made a breaking change, especially if, they're a large company with many moving parts. Maybe they don't publish an API, or if we're on a beta API. So we have a set of tests that run against our partners in production so that we know that our interface is still good. And as long as we're not doing it excessively, it's fine. But likewise, not every one of our tests goes and hits a third-party partner because the whole breadth and scale of our testing is not relevant. So sometimes we'll use a mock, or we'll use a local sub instead of a third-party partner. It just depends on the goal.
Great. If you have questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A chat box right there. I think it's on the bottom of your screen. But another question is, what does data sanitization mean?
Melissa, you can take this one.
Yeah, so what is data sanitization? So data sanitization means making sure that there is no PII in the data, right, that you're using for testing, and making sure it can't be traced back to any actual data, right? It means it's cleaned, it's anonymized, like truly anonymized, and not just like make-believe anonymized.
Okay.
Yeah, basically.
All right. Well, I think unless anyone has any other questions,
I see a question in the chat.
I think we got to that one.
Okay.
Yeah. But anything else, Talia or Melissa, that you want to end with before we say goodbye?
I would just say, like, with testing in production, like, don't be scared. That was like my initial reaction, and it's a lot of people's initial reaction. But if you're doing it safely with feature flags and you have the right data model, like Melissa was saying, you really don't have anything to be afraid of.
Exactly. Just make sure you have your rails in place, right? You know how to keep yourself, you know what safe looks like, and you know how to keep yourself safe. You know how to keep your service up and running and protect your real users.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that. And thank you, Talia and Melissa, for joining us for today. Really enjoyed this content. We will have the recording available for everyone post-webinar, and you can always send an email your questions or tweet the questions to Talia and Melissa. I'm sure they'd be happy to answer them. All right, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Bye.
Bye.